Kלים Perikut Zayin, Mishnah Yud Beis, and we carry on with the Mishnayos dealing with the Shiurim. Mishnah Yud Aleph said those things which were done b'midah daka, with the smallest midah. Now we're doing v'yesh omru b'midah gasa. There's a bunch of Shiurim going to come up where we use the midah gasa. In other words, we use the extra large size of the particular object which we're going to measure with. And they're all unconnected dinim here. And we start off with something called Maloi Tarvod Rokov. Rokov is not a very savoury subject. This is one of the Tumas mace. We're used to the fact that when a person dies, the flesh, the bossa of the mace, the bones, of course, are metame. But also one of the chelkei hameis hametamim is a thing called Rokov. Rokov is when the mace goes mouldy and you're left just with this mouldy powdery substance called Rokov. Rokov is a din that the powder is itself metame. There are certain conditions certain conditions that Chazal say must be complied with before the powder is metame. You can look that up in the Mishnah in the beginning of Aholos. But anyway, the shear for the Rokov is a Maloi Tarvod. Tarvod is a big spoonful of stuff. That's the loshon of the shear. Question is, what sort of spoon is this? So we used a big spoon, the biggest spoon around. Kimloi Tarvod Godel Shel Roifim, the big ladles that the Roifim, the doctors, use. I'm not quite sure what a doctor does with a ladle, but anyway, that's the shear, and it's roughly the shear is Maloi Chafnaim. It's a double handful of this powdery stuff. Is metame the masa over oil, and we'll deal with the dinim of Rokov when we do Mesechta Aholos. Another example is sometimes where we use the biggest one, the big shear, the jumbo size, comes to negoim, or gris negoim. For a nega to be metame, the nega must have the size of a gris. We've had the shear before. A gris is a split bean. There's a certain type of bean, and when you split it in half, it's called the gris. What sort of bean is this? We use the big bean. Ki gris ha-kilke. Kilke is the name of a place. The gris of the kilke, the size. The gris that comes from kilke. That's the big grist that we use. The shear is roughly the size of, Chazal call it Teisha Adoshois, 9 small lentils, the size of Lamed Vav Saras, 36 hairs. We mentioned this shear before, actually, in the Mishnah of Perik Ches. Another example where we use the big one. Normally, whenever we have an Issa Achila in the Torah, it's always a Kazayis. However, in Kippur, the Torah doesn't express the Issa by saying Lo Seichal, it says Ashaloi Su'une, whose body is not afflicted. In other words, you break the fast, you eat on Yom Kippur, and therefore you're not afflicted. Chazal say that the Shir Kazayis, eating Shir Kazayis, still keeps you a man who is Mu'une, you're still afflicted. You've got to eat more than a standard shear of a kazayis in order to be over this of Yom Kippur, and that shear is kaku seves hagasa, like a large date. Kamoya, the size of the date, uche gari nosa, including the stone inside the date. Of course, you take out all the air spaces. You're left just with the flesh of the fruit and the stone. That's a shear of a keseves. That's the shear for a chida of Yom Kippur. Another example of a big one is v'noidos yain v'shemen. Leather bottles used for storing wine and oil. If they have a hole, then that hole could render the noid to be tor because it's now a shevekli. How big does that hole have to be? So the Mishnah is telling you kapika gedola shalohen. Tosfos Yom Tov tells us that actually there's a few different ways to learn this Mishnah, but it's easy if we accept the giris of the Tosfos Yom Tov, who takes out the word shalohen and says the shear is literally kapika kadola. Pika is, we've had this before, when you have a spindle to sew wool, you want to make the spindle heavy, so you take a metal ball and you put it over the spindle, and that gives weight to the spindle so that it doesn't rock too far. And that's the size of a pika, it's a small metal ball. And if the hole is big enough to fit, that a pika fits through, then the noid is considered to be broken and it's tired. And what sort of picker do we use? A big picker. It's measured by the big ones. Another example is the next case of the Mishnah. We're now going back to Oholos and Tumas Meis. You all know the rule that if there's a mess in a room, Tumah goes from room A to the next room, if it has a hole in between, a tefach by a tefach. That's standard. if you have a very small hole, tumah can't get through. As soon as the hole is a tefach by a tefach, tumah can move from one room to the next. However, that famous rule of a tefach al tefach is changed under certain circumstances. Says the Mishnah, if the hole between adjoining two rooms was not made on purpose, wasn't made by intent by the builder, it's just a hole which came there automatically. For instance, animals may have made it, or some sort of dry rot or fungus crumbled the wall. It's called shaloi nasa b'dei odom. Here now, because it wasn't made with intent, the hole must be bigger to allow tumah to go from one room to the other room. And it's much bigger than a tefach al tefach. Here the shiur is kimloi egref godel, the size of a very large fist. Whose fist is this? Zeu egref shel ben bateach. This is a giant of a man called Ben Bateach, the size of his fist. How big is that? We don't have him anymore, he's dead. Om Rabbi Yossi, Yeshnoi Karosh Godel Shel Odom. It's the size of an average size of a regular person's head. So a hole which just happened mamela between two rooms, the hole has to be as big as a head for the tumah to go through. And similarly, another type of hole, where we also use the bigger shear, is a hole, the shenaso bidei odom, a hole which was made between two rooms on purpose. Now normally that shear is tefach al tefach. However, if the hole was made lemo'or, to provide light, if you make a hole in a room, and the whole tachlis is so that light can flood in from the outside, then the size of that hole is actually more chomradik. Even if it's less than a tefach al tefach, it allows tumah to travel through the rooms. So what's the shear? Here we use another shear, a shear less than a tefach al tefach. Shi'uroi, the shear is kimloi makdeach godel shalishka. The size of makdeach is an awl, A-W-L, one of the instruments, a tool you find in a toolkit. The big one of the lishka, that's the shear of the hole to allow tumah to go through from room to room in the case where the hole is made lamor for light. Roughly this is, instead of being a tefach al tefach, it's actually roughly a third of a tefach by a third of a tefach. The actual details of this then you can find in the beginning of the 13th perek of Masechta Olis. And the Mishnah is telling you a few other simonim for this type of hole. Shuka pundoin huitalki, it's like the Italian pundoin, size of a small coin. Uchesela haniroinis, another type of coin, the sela, used by Nero the Caesar. And ochemloi nekev sheboil, you have an oil which is a yoke, and there's a hole to join the pieces of the oil together. The size of that hole is probably about this big, a third of a tefach by a third of a tefach. That's enough, Chazal say, that's enough for a hole to provide light, and if it's made for the purpose of providing light, then that is ma'avra tumah. That hole will allow tumah to go from one room to another room. And that's Mishnah Yud Beis, and we're coming up to Mishnah Yud Gimel, which is, and Yud Daled, which are actually a little bit